My name is Emily and I'm 18. Everything should be so simple. I'm young. I have my whole life ahead of me. That's what my parents, friends, and even casual acquaintances tell me. But sometimes I get this strange feeling, as if something is wrong. As if behind this perfect picture, something dark is hiding. A feeling like something is waiting around the corner. I'm a second-year student studying psychology, and everything related to the human mind fascinates me. Maybe that's why I find it so hard to relax. I'm always trying to dissect people, understand their motives hidden behind innocent smiles. My friends say I'm too obsessed with this. Lisa laughs when I notice, once again, that someone is asking too many questions or smiling unnaturally. I smile back, but deep down there's always this feeling, as if something is wrong. I have a habit of running in the mornings. These runs are my salvation. Just me and the silence around. At this time, the city seems empty, and sometimes I lose myself in my thoughts. But in the last few days, something has changed. I started noticing shadows. Light movements at the periphery of my vision, as if someone is following me. Sometimes I look back, but I see nothing. Maybe it's just my vivid imagination, but deep down I know it's not just a coincidence. My dorm room has always been my refuge. But even here, among familiar things, sometimes I get a strange feeling that I'm not alone. Especially in the evenings, when I sit alone in silence, studying or reading books. Lisa and Tina often come over, but when they leave, the room becomes too quiet. I start listening to every sound, every rustle outside the door. Maybe I'm just overworked. The semester was tough, and constant thoughts about human nature sometimes drive me crazy. But I can't shake the thought that something is nearby or someone waiting. Waiting to shatter this illusion of safety that I've so carefully created. Maybe I'm just paranoid. But what if it's not just thoughts? What if I'm really in danger? I noticed a man named Jack. I don't know almost anything about him. We rarely cross paths. He lives alone in a house on the other side of the street. But lately, I've started noticing him more often. At first, he seemed harmless. Just a man in his 40s with a friendly smile who sometimes greets me when I leave the house. He always tried to strike up a conversation, and that was normal. After all, we are neighbors. But recently, something has changed. At first, it was little things. His gaze. When I pass by his house, it seems like his eyes linger on me a bit longer than necessary. I notice his silhouette in the window when I return from classes or the store. He often stands there, motionless, as if specifically waiting for me to pass by. I see his eyes following me. At first glance, it seems like a coincidence, but with each time, his presence becomes more and more intrusive. Last week, I ran into him at the mall. He was in the department where they sell household appliances, although I know for sure he has no business there. Our eyes met, and he smiled at me. That smile, usually friendly, now seemed frightening. His eyes were too attentive, too focused on me. I hurried away, but his presence left an unpleasant aftertaste. I tried to convince myself that it was all just coincidences. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it's my paranoia from the stress of studying. But the anxiety inside me is growing. Every morning, when I go out for a run, I catch a glimpse of him in the window. He stands there, motionless, his eyes following my every step. Today, I couldn't take it anymore and went to the police. They were polite, but their faces reflected skepticism. They explained that without concrete evidence, they have nothing to charge him with. He's just a neighbor. Maybe he's bored and paying attention to those around him, one of the officers said, shrugging. I returned home with the feeling that I was left alone with my fear. I don't know what to do. Maybe it's just coincidences. Maybe I'm imagining it all. But every time I see him in the window, I feel a chill run down my spine. My friends and I decided to relax after a tough week. A nightclub, loud music, laughter, and dancing. All of this was supposed to be my escape from the obsessive state of anxiety. Lisa insisted that we go out, and I agreed. although inside me there was an unpleasant feeling that I couldn't explain. In the club, everything was as usual: familiar faces, music that penetrates your whole body, and a sense of freedom. I tried to relax, dance, laugh like everyone else, but it didn't work. At some point, it seemed like a familiar silhouette flashed in the crowd. I shuddered. My heart started beating faster. I stopped, looking around. Somewhere in the darkness, among the lights and people, I saw him, Jack. He stood nearby, in the shadows, and looked straight at me. My breath caught. "Emily, are you okay?" Lisa looked at me worriedly when she noticed my state. "Yes." It just seemed. I tried to smile, but inside, everything tightened. It was him. I knew it. I started having trouble breathing. Everything spun around me. I quickly apologized and went to the bathroom, hoping for a moment of peace. Leaning against the mirror, I tried to calm down. It couldn't have been him. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. How many times have I seen him where he shouldn't be? Maybe it's just my paranoia. I splashed cold water on my face several times, trying to return to normalcy. When we were leaving to go home, I tried not to show my fear to my friends. They drove me to the apartment, laughing and saying goodbye on the go. I said goodbye and slowly approached the door, taking out my keys. My head was still spinning with fragments of thoughts. My heart was still beating faster than usual. I inserted the key into the lock when I felt a cold gust of wind behind me. And then something suddenly grabbed me. I didn't even have time to scream. Sharp pain and a strange sweetish smell instantly filled my lungs. Something wet pressed against my face. A rag. Chloroform. In the last moment, before plunging into darkness, I realized that this was the end. I didn't wake up right away. At first, there was a feeling of complete numbness. My body didn't obey, and my consciousness seemed to float in a thick, viscous fog. My head was pounding with pain, and everything around seemed unreal, like in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The first thing I realized was the silence. Absolute, oppressive silence. I couldn't hear any sounds from the street, no voices, not even the sound of the wind. Only my ragged breathing and the hum in my head. When my consciousness began to clear, I tried to move, but something held me in place. The cold, metallic weight on my ankle made me open my eyes. Around me was darkness, barely visible outlines of the room, and then I felt the chain on my leg, attached to the wall. My fingers touched the cold metal, and my chest tightened. Fear surged with such force that I could barely breathe. I frantically looked around, trying to understand where I was. The room was strange. The walls were covered with old mattresses, as if trying to muffle any sound, any possible movement. The floor was concrete, cold, smelling of dampness. The light came from a dim bulb under the ceiling, its faint flickering only intensifying the sense of horror. My head still pounded with pain, and memories of the last few hours began to surface. I was in a basement. It was obvious. In the room, there were no windows, only a massive door with a slot through which food could be passed or someone could be watched. My heart was pounding wildly in my chest, as if trying to escape. I knew I had been kidnapped. My stomach churned at the realization of this reality. I started screaming. My hands were shaking as I pounded on the wall, screaming at the top of my lungs until my voice went hoarse. It seemed like the world beyond this room had ceased to exist. No one could hear me. No one knew where I was. In my head, there was not a single clear thought, only fear. This paralyzing fear that was eating me from the inside. After a while, I heard someone approaching from outside. Heavy steps, slow and confident. They were getting closer to the door. My body instinctively tensed, fear gripping me even tighter. I pressed myself against the wall, feeling the cold concrete pressing against my back. The door slowly opened, and in the doorway stood him. Jack. His face was illuminated by the dim light of the bulb, and from this, his gaze seemed even colder. He was completely calm, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. As if the fact that I was here in this basement had been planned long ago, and he had finally carried out his plan. "You're awake." His voice was as calm as always. No anger, no worry. As if he was just asking how my day was. I felt a horror that couldn't be described in words spreading through me. Inside, everything shattered, as if the world around me had collapsed. What do you want?" My voice was barely audible. I could hardly speak, my tongue felt like stone, and my throat was dry. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me. His eyes were the same as they were in the mall, too attentive, too focused. He stepped forward, and I instinctively recoiled, although I couldn't go far because of the chain. "You're mine now, Emily," he said calmly. In those words, there was not a shred of doubt. No lies or games. This was his world, and I had ended up in his hands. My breath caught, and I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. In my head, there was not a single plan, not a single thought about how to escape. I only knew one thing. This place was my cage, and Jack was my jailer. Days blurred into one continuous torment. Time lost all meaning. I couldn't understand how much had passed. Hours, days, weeks. In the basement, there were no windows, only the dim light of the bulb that constantly flickered, reminding me that the world I knew was somewhere beyond this concrete hell. Jack came regularly. I didn't know exactly when. I just heard the footsteps from outside, that steady thud of boots that echoed in my head. Each time my heart stopped, and my body tensed with primal fear. He entered calmly, without haste, with that cold expression on his face that had become painfully familiar to me. In his eyes, there was never any emotion, no anger, no rage, only silent obsession. When he came closer, I tried to recoil, to back as far into the corner as possible, but the chain restricted my movements, reminding me each time that I couldn't escape him. The first time he touched me, it was like a slow-motion nightmare. I was so paralyzed with fear that I couldn't even resist. His hand touched my face, rough, cold, full of control. I tried to dodge, but he firmly gripped my jaw, painfully, so that my cheeks ached. I closed my eyes so I wouldn't see his face, but that only made it scarier. My skin seemed to burn under his touch. Every gesture of his was filled with power that I couldn't break. "You're mine, Emily." This phrase of his became a ritual that he repeated every time. And with each time, these words cut deeper into my consciousness. I screamed, resisted, but he was stronger. His hands twisted me with such ease, as if it were a long-rehearsed game where I always lost. The violence was not just physical. He tormented my mind as well. Each time he left me in complete darkness, depriving me not only of light but also of sounds, of any contact with reality. I sat on the cold floor, clinging to the remnants of my consciousness, trying not to go insane in this silence. Time passed too slowly, and my thoughts began to get confused. Sometimes it seemed like he was watching me even when he wasn't there, as if his presence always hovered in this room like a poisonous fog. But the worst were the moments when he just sat opposite me, silently. He never talked much, just watched. In those moments, I felt like an animal trapped in a cage. My breathing became ragged, my heart pounded, and in my head, there was only one thought: when will this end? But the end did not come. His torments became more sophisticated. One day, he brought a small radio into the basement. He turned it on and made me listen to some cheerful songs and news, as if showing me that the world outside continued to exist. But for me, it was now inaccessible. It was like torture, hearing life that was so close but at the same time so unreachable. He knew how to break me, how to destroy my spirit. Sometimes he brought me food, ordinary as if for a pet, porridge, bread, water. I couldn't refuse, although inside me everything screamed with humiliation. Every bite I swallowed was filled with pain and shame because I knew it was his way of reminding me that I was completely dependent on him. I lived by his rules, existed in this hell by his will. He hit me when I resisted. At first, it was just sharp pushes, but with each time, his hand became heavier, the blows became stronger. I felt my skin bruise under his fists. Each time when he entered, inside me everything screamed, "Not again." I tried to fight, tried to find the strength within me, but each time he entered, I felt something inside me dying. At some point, I began to detach myself. My mind seemed to split into two parts. One endured the pain and humiliation, and the other went somewhere far away, away from reality. I began to be silent, stopped screaming when he raped me. I stopped fighting because I understood that it only made things worse. This was my survival strategy, to become empty, invisible, to dissolve in the pain, to preserve at least the remnants of my mind. Every time he left, I tried to focus on one thing: how to escape. Everything changed when I started noticing the details. What at first seemed like a closed space gradually began to give more information. The ability to observe details, which I had learned in psychology, unexpectedly became my only salvation. Alone, deprived of everything familiar, I began to analyze my surroundings, to focus on things that I wouldn't have noticed before. And one day, these details began to form a frightening picture. I couldn't understand where I was for a long time. The room was dark. The walls were covered with old mattresses that muffled the sound, depriving me of the ability to scream. The floor was cold and hard like concrete. But this was not enough to understand where I was. I struggled with panic for a long time until one day I began to hear strange noises. It was a faint, barely audible sound that barely reached my hearing. At night, when Jack left and everything went quiet, I began to listen. The sound seemed muffled, but I realized that it came not from the room, but from above. It was like something every day, a rare knocking of footsteps, sometimes the sound of passing cars. I began to think that above my head there was a world, an ordinary one, from which I was separated only by walls. One day, when I lay on the cold floor, listening to these sounds, I began to notice changes in the air. It was damp, musty, with a characteristic smell of moisture. This reminded me of the basement in my parents' house, where we stored old things. The air there was always heavy and unpleasant, especially after rains. This smell brought me back to reality, and I realized I was not just in a room, I was underground. Further were the details that confirmed my guesses. On one of the walls, there was a small metal ventilation grill, through which I sometimes felt a faint draft. Through it came air, but it was not fresh. It had traces of something chemical, as if the air passed through pipes. I remembered that in houses, such ventilation systems are often installed in basements to provide minimal airflow in enclosed spaces. I also began to notice dampness on the floor. In one of the corners, time after time, a thin streak of water appeared. This was especially noticeable after several days of rain. Water seeped through the concrete, leaving muddy traces behind. And it was this fact that became crucial for me. I remembered how in the old house where I grew up, in the basement, water also accumulated after heavy rains. The basement was not very deep, but it was still underground, and each time after the rain, it filled with moisture just like here. At some point, I even felt cold metal pipes on the wall. These were water or sewage pipes. They ran along the wall, barely noticeable in the darkness, and when I touched them, I felt vibration. This only strengthened my suspicions. Such pipes are often laid in the basements of houses. They were not important for living spaces, but were necessary for servicing the communication system. When I realized all this, the fear became even stronger. I began to understand that I was in the basement of some house, hidden from the outside world. I was separated not just by walls, but by layers of earth that did not allow sounds to escape. This realization chilled me to the bone. I realized that most likely I was under Jack's house. This explained everything: his ability to come and go whenever he wanted, how he hid my presence from the world. No one even suspected that I was there, in the basement of his house, hidden from everyone. The realization that I was in the basement was the first step towards trying to escape. This was the desperation that pushed me to the thought that I couldn't stay there forever. I had to act, otherwise Jack would continue to break me, day after day, until I became just a shadow of myself. I couldn't allow that to happen. I had to find a way. I began to carefully examine everything around me. The space in which I was closed, but still not ideal. Like any place, it had its weak points. The ventilation grill that I noticed on the wall became one of those hooks. It was small, but it still gave access to the air. Perhaps through it, I could transmit a signal to the outside, or at least use it to somehow influence the enclosed space. However, the real chance appeared when I noticed his routine. Jack was methodical. He came to me on a schedule in the morning, afternoon, evening. But sometimes, especially late at night, he disappeared for several hours. I understood that he lived his ordinary life on the surface, went to work or on business. These were my only chances when he left me alone for long enough to try to do something. I knew that each of his returns was deadly dangerous. He could notice even the slightest change in my behavior if I tried to open the door or damage something. Therefore, I acted carefully and slowly, step by step, thinking through each of my moves. My opportunity came one night. It was another long, damp, and cold evening when I heard him leave and slam the door. I knew he wouldn't return for at least a few hours. In my head, I already had a plan. I used a small piece of metal that I found in the corner of the room among the trash, perhaps part of some old structure. This was my only weapon. For several days, I had been secretly picking the lock on the chain on my leg, checking if I could loosen it. I patiently ground the metal against the concrete floor, turning it into something rough but sharp, like a crude tool. When he left, I began working on the lock that held the chain on my leg. I was not a specialist, but the lock was old, and the metal seemed to have already succumbed to corrosion. I felt that if I was lucky, I could open it. That night, when he left, I continued my work. Inside, everything burned with fear that I wouldn't have time, that he would return earlier. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't allow myself to stop. At some point, I heard a soft click. It was the lock. It opened. I froze in place, almost not believing that it had happened. I removed the chain from my leg and for a moment just sat in silence, afraid to move. I knew that I had to act quickly, but carefully. I approached the door and pressed my ear to its surface. Behind it was silence. I understood that the door was most likely locked, but my chances of salvation were connected with the fact that it could be closed on an ordinary lock, and not on something more complex. I used my crude tool to try to pick the lock. My trembling fingers made each movement slower than I wanted, but I knew I couldn't afford to make a mistake. The door gave way when I heard a soft creak of the lock. Opening it slowly, I saw a narrow staircase leading up. The light was dim, but it was enough to understand. This was the path up to freedom. Each step under my feet creaked, and my heart beat so loudly that it seemed it would give me away. But at the top I saw a door leading into the house. It was not locked. This was his mistake. Jack was confident that no one could escape. He didn't even think it was possible. I carefully opened the door and found myself in a dark kitchen. It looked ordinary: a table, chairs, a stove. But this was the most frightening thing: the everyday nature of this place where I had been imprisoned for so long. I didn't linger. I knew that every second counted. I knew that any moment could be crucial. I tiptoed through the house and saw the main front door. It was locked with a chain, but I easily removed it and opened the lock. Outside was the night air, fresh and cold, which literally burned my lungs. I ran out onto the street. My legs refused to obey, but I knew I had to run. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, until I saw the light of streetlights on the neighboring street. Their Finally, I saw a car and people. I screamed with all my might, and they stopped. This was my saving scream. The police arrived quickly. They found me, shivering and exhausted, but alive. Jack didn't have time to return. He was arrested, and this nightmare ended. But even then, when I sat in the ambulance, I couldn't fully believe that it was real. But I did it. I survived.